doing a really good job here. It's very well run. It's nice not having to deal with any audio video problems, so that's awesome. So the background on this talk is that for the last 3 years I've been doing a lot of consulting with a lot of different companies and really seeing a lot of people struggling with threat intelligence. And when for my free time, I like to trade off reading like a technical book and then read a book for fun. So I'm reading like history books, spy books, and then I'll mix in like a forensics book. That way to break it up so I'm not just reading about editing a disk in hex all the time. So a little bit of background on me. Like I said, I was previously at CrowdStrike, and I've just switched over to a new role working with the internal IR team over at Splunk. I've been in the industry for about 15 years, working mostly in incident response and forensics, and I'm super into IR. I'm kind of like an IR adrenaline junkie, which has led to some work-life imbalances, hence me getting out of consulting and wanting to work more at a slower pace. So I recently left CrowdStrike. But I've spent a lot of time in targeted industries over the time, so I've had a lot of experience dealing with nation-state threats, and that's led to kind of some interest in helping people better defend their organizations. So the book that kind of inspired me to come up with this talk, combined with my work where I was seeing people spending a lot of money and not getting ROI from threat intelligence, was a book from Christopher Andrews, which I would highly recommend everybody check out. It's not even that new of a book, but it's fascinating, and he's written a lot of books. His other most famous book is about the KGB, so I would recommend that one as well. But what I wanted to cover was kind of like the current state of affairs, what's going on with threat intel. So how many people here at least consume threat intel? Is there anybody here that does full-time threat intel as their job? Okay, we got a couple. Great. So I'm going to cover that first and then go over some older stuff, some stuff way before SIGINT and way before computers even existed, because I think there's some lessons there to be learned, and highlight, which may not make sense now, but I want to make 5 key points about how organizations can be better about how they run their threat intel team. And I thought it was pretty cool that the professor that kicked off the conference this morning, he mentioned that the problem, was a lot of it was, human and sociology. So a lot of this is how to manage C-level psychology and get them to get on board with threat intelligence, because a lot of the problem is they're just not interested in it. They don't see it as, they're not sure that it even matters to their business. So, first thing with threat intelligence, there's, I guess, 2 major breakdowns of threat intelligence. The first is tactical threat intelligence, which is much easier to ramp up, and I think that's where most organizations are having success. How many people are, taking in indicator feeds and building detections and finding evil from, data like this, like IOCs, indicators of compromise? So I think it's well understood, and I compare that to like being able to sink a 3-foot putt. It's very consistent. There's frameworks. It's mostly all within your security organization. So like the person that's producing it also reports to the same person that's consuming it. So there's less friction. You don't have to depend on a lot of people to be really good at tactical threat intelligence. And it's more what I would call binary. So it's like either this MD5 is this hash or it's not, or this cert was signed or this compile time was this or it's not. So it's much less gray than maybe strategic intelligence, which I would compare to trying to hit a 300-yard drive to a certain spot on the fairway every single time. It's your chances are when you write a threat intel report, you're guessing a lot. You're saying like with medium confidence, I think this is going to happen. And the reality is you can't be right every time, and you're never going to have like complete information. And so for that reason, strategic threat intel is really, really tough to do. And that's where I see people building things, but not really doing fresh analysis. They're just repackaging intel from other companies. So I think that's something to point out. And then there's some other themes that are happening right now. It's kind of an obsession with how many data feeds do you have. I mean, I had a very large vendor try to sell me when I was working for a client. I was representing them, and they said, well, we have over 80 feeds, and how could you possibly do threat intelligence without our data lake? I'm like, okay, I don't think he even knew what he was saying. And I just kind of laughed at him and just said, okay, we're not going with these guys. So a feed is a part of it, but that's really just something that you would just feed straight into your detection, and there's not a lot of context around it. But there's for some reason, an obsession with like having, 50 feeds, 100 feeds. Like we have the latest threat intelligence, and I think a lot of that is just creating a lot of busy work. I'm also seeing, and I touched on this earlier, specifically around strategic threat intel. Companies are creating these fusion centers, which have really awesome displays. They look great. They look like something from an episode of like 24. And I'll go in and take a tour and look at it, and they're either empty, or I'll like talk to the people and say, hey, what are you guys doing? And it's, somebody from legal just checking their email, or it's somebody from the server team, like just doing his daily job and nothing to do whatsoever with combining intelligence. And I keep seeing this over and over again. I'm like, well, I don't know what's going on, but these guys just spent, over $1 million building this fusion center, and it's not really producing any results. And then also the whole concept of just repackaging. So they'll take, feeds from FireEye and Flashpoint and CrowdStrike and just repackage it into a summary and say here, but no real new analysis is being done. So that's something that I think people can improve on. Hiring. So another trend that I've observed is companies kind of tend to get fooled by hiring people from the government. So not every job in the DoD is created equal. So one company that I work with, they hired a person to lead their computer incident response from the DoD, but he was doing like fire incident response or environmental incident response. And of course, he flamed out and didn't last more than a year, but they were totally, in love with, we're hiring an ex-DoD guy, but they didn't really vet and understand, there's different MOSs, or there's different roles, and you need to make sure you find it like an actual analyst who is, looking at data and creating fresh reports. And I think generally, I don't think the work product is very good, and it probably goes out to all the threat intel vendors too. I don't know how people perceive this, but I don't think a lot of the reports that people get either from vendors or that they do internally is all that. Does anybody have any different experiences, or has anybody like found a vendor that they think is all? Yeah, so I think most people are kind of like, Yeah, it's like, yeah, so Flashpoint has some good stuff. And I've heard, I think, what was the company that FireEye bought? Eyesight. I heard Eyesight had a really good portal. Somebody told me that, but I don't know what it's like now. Darktrace? What's it called? MAS 360. Okay, I'll have to check that out. But yeah, so that's a kind of like a survey of some of the issues that I've been seeing. And now on to geeking out a little bit about history. So before we get into some more modern stuff, I wanted to dive into a little bit about somebody that was like so far ahead of their time, it's just ridiculous. So that quote up there was from George Washington, and I'm like, how did he back then even understand this? Like, he understood that, you were going to combine all these diverse sets of intelligence that separately don't mean anything, but when you put them together, he was able to determine, what the British were doing and where to move his forces. He was able to, basically, when he had already been beat back and had less troops, he was floating misinformation to the British to inflate his troop totals so that they didn't attack him. And he did this on multiple occasions where the French were coming into land, and join the Revolutionary War. And what he did is he sent a courier that was captured to make them think that his forces were going to attack New York, and that allowed the French army to land safely and not get attacked. So it was a huge turn in the war that played out over and over again. And if you've ever heard of this show on AMC, I think it's maybe in season 3. I've only watched season 1, but it was pretty awesome. It talks all about this, and he came up with this spy ring that was called the Culper spy ring, and he named that after the county that he lived in. It was Culpeper County in Virginia, so he just named the spy ring Culper. So all throughout this time, he was using his intelligence, mostly military intelligence, to basically beat out a superior military. And when he finally came into office as president, he set up the first, first formalized Secret Service to do intelligence operations. And after 3 years, his little Secret Service thing was already 12% of the budget, the federal budget, which is, if you compare that to today, that's pretty massive. But it turns out that was really short-lived, because after he got out, none of the people that came after him were all that interested in threat intelligence. And then by the time the next war broke out in 1812, it was all the way down from 1 million to 50,000 a year. And that led to some issues for them being ready. So can you guys see that text, or is it just too small for you back there? Too small? Okay, sorry about that. So from this era that I'll call the isolationist era, there was a lot of nothing. There was a lot of presidents that really just didn't get intelligence. But there's some interesting stories that came out of this time. Most of the focus was on generals having their own spies. So each little army had their own little intel force, nothing centralized, nothing coordinated. But there's a funny story that actually, I guess, isn't so funny when you look at it together. But during Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, there was a death threat on his life. And he traveled with a guy named Pinkerton, which, if you've ever heard the Pinkerton Agency, that's still around today, helped protect him and smuggled him into the city so he wouldn't get assassinated. But during that time, when he came into the city, he was dressed up like a woman. And the press got a hold of that and just started making fun of him. Well, it turns out, ever since they made fun of him in the press, he's like, well, I don't want all that security, leave me alone, just let me do my thing. And of course, then he got assassinated in the theater because he didn't pay attention to his own personal security. Something else interesting from that time, that the major form of communication and SIGINT during that time was the telegraph. So Lincoln used to hang out there, and they actually had 3 code breakers that cracked the Confederate codes and allowed them to bust up some counterfeiting that was going on. But they called them the Sacred 3, and they were only 17, 20, and 23 years old. That's how old they were, and they were breaking codes, so it's pretty interesting. And of course, intelligence played a role in the Gettysburg battle as well, where they were able to predict when the Confederates were going to attack. Now, during this time, if you take a step back, the U.S. had nothing, no foreign intelligence, no real capability, but French, Russia, Germany, all their peers had code-breaking capabilities, and they were reading everything. All of our State Department traffic from our embassies, they were able to read this. And the British had something called Room 40, which eventually became Bletchley Park, which is the modern-day GCHQ. And that started all the way back then. Another cool thing about, this time about World War I, I know when I was in school, I was taught that the reason that the U.S. got into the war was because they sank the Lusitania, and that drew us into the war. But that was actually 2 years before the U.S. got into the war. The reason that we got into the war was actually the Zimmerman cable, which was a SIGINT intercept, where Germany was plotting to have Mexico start a second front and attack the U.S. And that was 2 months before we got into the war, or actually less than 2 months, and we were in the war because of that. So that's one thing that I think like the history books probably need to be updated for that. Let's see. A lot of the presidents just had no clue. So along that theme of this time where it's just isolationists, Woodrow Wilson, and this is, during World War I, everybody's fighting. He didn't even believe or understand that everybody was spying on each other. He had no clue, and he admitted this publicly. But following that, they finally stood up what was the precursor to the NSA, which was a team called Black Chamber. But that only lasted 10 years, and because there was no, existing war, they ended up shutting it down. And of all the people, probably the one that people would say would probably be the most inept about foreign affairs and military intelligence, Truman. He actually didn't even know what he was doing at the time. I think he was duped, but he signed all the major directives that established, what would become the CIA, the NSA, all those capabilities, the National Security Council. They weren't called exactly that at the time, but he was the one that established it. And in his memoirs, he didn't even want to admit that he did it because he thought it was like ungentlemanly. He didn't understand that countries were doing this and spying on each other. So this is a long time from Washington to World War II, where all these countries were way more advanced in code breaking. They were stealing our secrets. They were light years ahead of the U.S. And so we got a pretty late start to the game. And I think a lot of that was just because of the isolationists. Most people just thought we were on our own here and didn't need to be involved in any of the European or Asian, conflicts. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on is a concept about when we're trying to present intelligence to leadership is failure of imagination. They're never going to want to admit that something can happen. Let's think of like Crypto Locker or WannaCry, right? If you would have told them that before that occurred, you would have people swearing up and down that our manufacturing network is air-gapped. There's no way that we could get crypto lockered, until after the fact. Then they see it, and then they're all of a sudden like, oh, okay, I get it now. This is a real threat. They can't imagine it. And I think that that's what we have to do as people that have to sell threat intelligence and build a successful program. We have to help leadership understand, like, these are real threats, and you can't just think of what you know. You have to worry about things that you can't even comprehend that exist. There's this whole timeline, so I apologize for the wall of text. But leading up to Pearl Harbor, so it's, I think, considered the biggest intelligence disaster for the U.S. In September 1940, we had already broken Japan's code. In May 1941, they knew we broke it, but they thought that their special purple machine was okay. It was just some of their code. So they kept using it, even though they knew we were getting some of their information. And then there's this bizarre thing. So everybody knows December was when Pearl Harbor occurred. And they had this arrangement where the Army would provide updates one month and the Navy would provide updates the other month because the two agencies fought each other. But it turned out the month November, the month before Pearl Harbor, the Army decided they weren't going to deliver updates. So pretty bad timing there. So the Navy, I think, tried to keep giving them information, but it wasn't their job to do it. November 5th, Japan actually decided that they wanted to make the invasion. Okay. November 25th, FDR tells his entire cabinet, hey, we're going to get attacked. Okay. On 26th, they observe that troops have left Shanghai from Japan. And on the 27th, they decrypt instructions that the embassies that they know how to destroy their code machines, their papers, their books, so that they're ready when they get the order, they can do this. So one, FDR says, hey, we're getting attacked, and they know that they're going to get, they know that the embassies have been warned so that they can destroy their stuff. Then the next day he goes on vacation. It's like, what the hell? So on the 28th, he goes on vacation, and the day following that, they send out a major alert to just the Asia fleet. So like think of the Western Pacific, just they got the warning. So they had no clue that they couldn't even comprehend that they would be attacked at Pearl. They had all this information happening, but their imagination made them think that it was only this certain area of the country or of the globe that could be attacked. And even further leading up into that, they intercepted messages from Tokyo to Berlin saying, hey, we're going to war. So they knew that the attack was coming. They even warned part of their fleet, but they never said anything to the base at Hawaii. So they were caught completely unaware. And that was strictly, failure to even imagine that could have occurred. It turns out and obviously this is like super, I guess you would call it like hindsight bias, because we all know what happened. So it's somewhat biased in the fact that we know how it played out. But the code that they were using, the naval codes, they only assigned like 2 to 5 analysts in the entire military to break the certain naval code. So they didn't break it in time, but after the war, they went ahead and broke it and found out, hey, they were coming for Hawaii, and they found all these plans that if they would have just assigned, more than 2 to 5 people, they would have broke it no problem. The same thing, failure to imagine. You would think that they would learn from this, right? They failed to imagine the Tet Offensive in the 60s. They saw all this traffic about all these attacks on all these major cities, and they just said, no, there's no way, like this is a diversion. And of course, I think U.S. forces lost, thousands of men in the attack, and the whole time they were like, no, this didn't happen. And it just baffles me that like they have all this intelligence and refuse to like even believe that this could occur. The next concept is like, to me, this is the most important one. Of all these, this would be the one that would allow you guys to be the most successful in getting more resources or getting trust with your executives. And it's the fact that like when we're talking about psychology, people always want to know what their peers are doing. Like, how do I compare to what company X is doing? How do I compare to what the best practices are, or his friend, their buddy CISO at this other place? Like, the more you can shape your analysis to align with what your peers are doing, the more that they will be wanting to do what you want them to do. And over time, this came out over and over again. So in the 1880s, there was the War of the Pacific, and the U.S. was completely blindsided. The U.S. thought that they had the most powerful Navy, and they turned out that, like, the Chilean Navy in the 1800s apparently was like 4 times more powerful and more modern than the U.S. Navy. So immediately they freaked out and established the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Military Intelligence Division, and Congress authorized a bunch of spending just because they were afraid, we're behind. So, I mean, you can just see how powerful it is that if your CISO or CIO or C-level figures out, hey, we're Bank of America and we're so far behind JP Morgan, okay, here's another $100 million, buy every tool. Air gap power, the same thing happened again. Leading up to World War II, the U.S. estimated that the Germans had 6,500 planes. They actually only had 1,700. And it turns out the Allied forces had way more planes than the Germans. And because of this, FDR asked for 10,000 planes. They only had 1,700. So it's The same thing happened again, the bomber gap. In 1955, the Air Force said that the Russians had 600 to 800 bombers. They actually had less than 200. And so, of course, the U.S. started building more bombers. Missile gap. The Air Force and then a group called the National Intelligence Estimates said that the Russians had like 100 ICBMs ready with plans to grow to 1,500. The U.S. only had 130, but the real number, the Russians only had 4. So it's just scary how wrong they were and how constantly they overestimated. And because of that, obviously, we spent a lot more money on defense. Here's another thing to be worried about with your intelligence program, and it's overestimating your capabilities. So especially like when new leadership comes in, and you've got to go report to them and say, like, here's our capabilities, here's what we can do, because they're like, I don't know you, what do you do, what can you do for me? And so, of course, you want to put your best foot forward and make it look like you're walking on water with your program. But you got to be careful there. You want to look good, but you don't want them to think like, one, that you're 100% right all the time, or like you have capabilities that you don't. And it's actually more important to probably, present a more accurate picture than to look like you have more than you do, because then they're going to rely on you, and then you're going to find out like, oh yeah, those servers actually aren't patched. So something that came up when I think it was in 1952, the head of the CIA reported back to the president that he had 1,500 agents in North Korea. But when they actually went to go like prove that out, he had only 200 in the office in Seoul, and none of them spoke Korean. But he reported back to the president that he had 1,500 agents. And it found out that like over time, all their agents that they had sent over the border had all been killed. Like none of them transmitted back anything of value. So that was pretty embarrassing. And in his memoirs, Beadle Smith said, "Yeah, I was just too embarrassed. I didn't want the other branches to know that I was, overstating my capabilities." So that's pretty silly. This also happened again when Kennedy came into office, the whole Bay of Pigs thing. So that would have been planned for like, I think it was like, 4 or 5 years under Eisenhower. And Kennedy came in and literally like within the week or so, it was like 10 days. He didn't have much time to even, when you're coming in as a new president, they're doing the nuclear codes, they're doing all these other things, you're having to nominate people. So within that short time frame, he had to decide whether or not he was going to go forward with this. And he basically said, like, these guys seem like they know what they're doing. They come off really smart. So he went ahead with it. And it turns out that the advising Marine that was devising the plan for landing, he had only done one amphibious landing in his whole life, versus some of the other people from World War II had done, 30. Throughout the course of the war. So he had no experience, and they actually landed in a swamp. So that didn't end well for them. And if you just look at the numbers, they landed with 1,400 troops. Castro sent 20,000 at them. So, yeah, it's kind of overstating capabilities. The same thing happened again when Jimmy Carter came on board. They had just deployed this awesome new satellite technology, the keyhole satellites. And they came in and wowed him and showed him like they could, see down the chimney and like see the stripes in the parking lot and where somebody was parked. And that was like crazy for back then in the late 70s having that technology. And so that gave him a distorted opinion of, what they could actually do, which was a lot less when it came to other areas like of human intelligence and stuff that led to the hostage crisis later, because he just didn't have what he thought he had in terms of intelligence. All right. Being Milton. So what I mean by this is you don't want your intelligence reports to sound like Milton. Just mumbling, background noise. Like if you send them just too much information, or you're just not giving really solid presentations, I mean, they already don't want to hear from you anyway. You know, we're the geeks from IT security, like they could care less. But bombarding them with a ton of information probably isn't the best technique. It's funny to watch the progress of this, of where the different presidents got so much information and finally complained. So FDR, when they first started decrypting codes, he was getting 50 separate decrypts a day on his desk. So no real summary. Sometimes the decrypts conflicted each other. Nobody answered his questions. They just dumped 50 decrypts on his desk every day. Finally, in 46, Truman just flipped the lid and got pissed off and says, "Give me a summarized brief." So from then on, they got like an actual summary, because it just, that old way wasn't going to work, right? Even if you look at FDR, he never even acted on any of it, because he's like, I don't even know what to make of this. It's just like, you're dumping stuff on me. So it's like a lot of, especially if you have to work for somebody from the military, they have this concept of bluff, where it's bottom line up front. If you don't tell them in that first few lines what you want, they just stop reading. So in 61, finally, I think it was JFK asked for a checklist. So they changed the way they did it, and it's like, give me, a one-line summary of what it is, because I don't have a lot of time here. And he would get it every morning with an analyst to actually answer his question. So JFK actually, I think, worked for a time in O&I, so he actually had a little bit of a background with the intelligence. And he actually was a good consumer. He would tell them like what I like and what I don't like, versus FDR never said anything. That was, I think, a good time, at least from the CIA's perspective, because they had somebody that was listening to them. Now, then you have LBJ. So he came in, and he actually secretly thought the CIA sabotaged him. So he basically, from day one, hated these guys. And so the president used to get daily updates. After 10 days, he just said, nope, I don't even want updates from you guys. And then finally, he's like, I just want one page, and I want it before I go to bed. So it's not like you're starting the day off and you're going to take actions. This is something what do you do with something you get before you read, before you go to bed? Forget. So the only feedback they ever got from him was one time the report was 2 pages and he complained. And then a funny story about Carter. So he was getting all this intelligence, but he was getting so much, he literally had to take speed reading classes because it was taking him too long to read. So I think, this is another important concept, that we need to be brief and have high quality in what we communicate from intelligence. If something can be summarized in 4 bullet points, then do it. A 20-page report, you're going to lose. Executives don't want to read that. Like, they're 1 paragraph tops, and then they're out. Another cool thing another thing we need to be cognizant of with our threat intelligence program is what you can call politicized intel, or basically forcing the intel to match your view. So I would say that anybody that's ever been a consultant and has to deal with lawyers understands this concept really, really well, where they will sit there and say, nope, you didn't find that. That's something don't put that in the report. Like, that ain't happening. They want to shape, what you're going to report or what you believe to fit their narrative. And there's a long, long history of this happening. Obviously, the movie The Post right now, has anybody seen that? It was pretty good. It tells a story about the Pentagon Papers and stuff that really happened during LBJ but blew up during Nixon. But starting off back with Teddy Roosevelt a long time ago, he would tell his Office of Naval Intelligence, like, just straight up, like, you have to lie about our numbers. You just need to give me intelligence that shows that we need to rebuild our Navy. and he was obsessed with battleships. And he said, we need to build more battleships. Well, by the time the war broke out, which was, I think, the Spanish-American War, the U.S. was actually short on destroyers because he forced them to build so many battleships. So it really messed up like the naval capabilities. MacArthur, he actually didn't want to even listen to any of these. So he had all this signals intelligence that China was going to attack. So if you know the story of North Korea, MacArthur basically drove all the way up to the border of China and North Korea, and he thought everything was good, and he kept getting all these reports saying China's getting ready to attack you. It's not like an army of 200,000 Chinese is hard to see, right? That's a lot of people coming at you, and you have aerial surveillance. So he was getting all these reports, and he refused to believe it, and of course they attacked and drove them back. Same thing with Eisenhower. He put together his own little intelligence, or his own commission, to create a study that said we need more covert action. That was their goal. Like, it wasn't an actual study. He's just saying, this is what you will determine. Give me a report. And of course, he went on and probably directed more coups and more government, sabotaging elections than any president at the time. And then the last one here, I thought something that was interesting was that during the war, LBJ didn't want to hear anything that was against the war. He only wanted to hear intelligence that supported his viewpoint. So he didn't listen to anybody on the National Security Council. He just went and had lunch with his guys on Tuesday, and that's how they set Vietnam policy. So it's pretty scandalous, some of the things that have happened. Okay, so for time, let's recap. Failure of imagination. So we need to really focus when we're trying to communicate threats to leadership. Embrace what ifs. So even though they may say, or even IT may say that's impossible, we have two-factor. Well, maybe not. Was two-factor there 3 months ago, or what about this new business you just acquired? So we really need to talk about what ifs. Well, let's just assume that it does happen and walk through that scenario. What would we do? Tackle all the unknowns. What do we not know about our business? What can hurt us? Just talking to people and learning more about the business, and then communicating where your risks are can go a long way. Because the last thing you want is a leadership team that thinks that they're invulnerable, or they have best-in-class security and nothing will ever happen to them. The second point, I can't emphasize this it's just been very successful for me. So I would assume that it would work for you guys, but just the fact of, competitive intelligence, that's already a thing today. So all major companies probably have a big competitive intelligence team that's giving them business intelligence and SAP and all that stuff. They're already making big investments. So the more you can slant your threat intelligence to be well, this is how our peers are doing it, or competitors, the more I think gains and more trust you can build, I think, because they tend to take that, they overweight that for some reason. Obviously, never overstate your capabilities. That's a pretty easy one. In order so that you don't just sound like noise and get ignored, you're not going to want to send reports every single day. You're not going to want to do that. Choose quality. So one single quarterly briefing that's really well done can be way more powerful than, every day sending them little briefs of stuff that they don't read. It just becomes background noise. Politicized intelligence. I mean, obviously you want to maintain your integrity here. It's hard to do. People can put a lot of pressure on you. You might have options on the line. There may be all these things where you might just say, hey, the easiest thing is just to go along with it. And, everybody just has to make their own choice about what they do there. But I think the best thing would be to just say, here's the facts, and you could do with it whatever you want. And there was a really good example about how to do this. So the Central Intelligence DCI Holmes, remember when I told you that LBJ, and I think Nixon too, they both hated the CIA. So his approach was, I'm not going to comment at all on policy. I'm just going to give you the facts. And his goal was to build trust. So he focused on building trust with that person. And then his point was, once I built up the trust, he didn't want to comment on like, should I do this? They just said, here's the data. And that built up that trust. And then he also recommended, like, when he was talking to, I think it was LBJ, like if he didn't get his point across in 60 seconds, he lost. So like the longer he took to get his point across, the less likely it was that he was going to even convince anybody of anything. So and I thought that was really good because he turned that relationship around and actually became effective after he built up trust. Lastly, you got to be like Rob Lee. The guy's awesome. So read everything you can from that guy about threat intelligence. And we're a little bit over, so questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to gauge your thoughts. A lot of what we think of threat intelligence is information. So in your view, what is the difference between information and intelligence in so many teams kind of construe the two?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing there is going to be context. So I would say, you have data, and then you have information, and then you have intelligence. And so you want to have context and also some kind of recommendation. So you want to state the facts and then state, like, here's what we would advise, because that's the biggest thing is that people say, well, it's not actionable, so why am I spending time reading it, right? So actionable and context is the key. So understanding, one, where did you get this information? How reliable is it? Versus just having an IP address. What makes it the intelligence is the context, level of confidence, and then some action, right? But yeah, that's a great question.
About keeping up with Joneses, are you aware of any benchmarking resources that talk about how much companies are spending on cybersecurity preparation? There's a lot of data about incident response rating, but not as much about how much the companies will need to spend on preparation.
Yeah. So her question was, is there any benchmarks on preparation? There's nothing that I've seen. I think your best bet really is just to establish, discussions with your peers, because I don't think that's something that's super controlled, but also maybe if you're in one of the industries that has an ISAC, that's one option. MITRE has a lot of stuff. There's different reports out there, but I've never ever seen one that's specifically around preparation. I've seen like overall budgets and tools, but not that, so sorry.
Very quick one. So you mentioned about MITRE and you mentioned about ISAC. Could you please share, and there are a couple of ones such as InfoGuard or PIN. Could you please share with us one of the best ways for us to obtain those actionable threat intelligence within a particular vertical that we're in, depending on which industry there's,
Yeah, so his question was, how do you obtain actionable threat intelligence? I've always recommended like a three-prong approach. So one, the first thing is analyze all your own incidents. So do root cause, run that stuff to the ground, because that's really giving you the first leg of it, understanding what's hitting you. Then, add a couple commercial feeds, see what happens. You can integrate that in. And then the last thing is with your peers. So there's a lot of companies outside of the formal ISAC stuff. Outside of the financial services, which I'm sure a lot of people here are involved in that, the ISACs haven't been that great from what I've seen from the one outside of that, but a lot of closed circles. I can't mention any of them by name, but like the closed groups of people seem to share the most information, and you're just talking about sharing campaigns, and I think that gives you a lot of visibility into what's happening. I don't know. Does anybody else have any advice there about that one?
Expiration dates on a lot of these tactical threat intel reports are things that might be relevant in this time frame. Maybe even a month later might not be relevant, and you might be seeing an environment of worry and panic and thinking, compromise because we see this indicator, and a lot of times there's no follow-up saying these indicators are no longer relevant.
Yeah, so that's a big, I would call that a major pain in the ass. So aging out your indicators, because so much of that is shared infrastructure. So you get an alert 3 months later, and it's like a hosting provider, and it's not even malicious. So yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, so I know with tactical CTI, it's pretty easy, if it's good tactical CTI, to make it actionable, right? To like take an immediate action, do something about it. I'm curious to hear your suggestions on how to make strategic CTI incorporate more actionable steps, especially pitching it to, high-level executives and stuff.
Yeah. So I think first, I would want to, if you have a CISO, look for what he's looking for. Then venture out into the other parts of the business. So in a business that I worked at previously, I spent a lot of time on M&A and looking at that, because a lot of the M&A, we had a lot of phishing and attacks around that and people trying to breach our network. That's a good one, but a lot of it depends on your business, what vertical you're in, to figure out what the best route is. But I think definitely M&A, peer intelligence, that kind of stuff. But also, number one should be your CISO first, and hopefully that person is engaged and wanting to do that. But like whatever your business is, so if it's online transactions, then you're going to want to figure out a way to make your threat intelligence align with that, whatever threats are facing that. Did you have one?
Yeah, well, I was going back to, so on the tactical side, even if some of those indicators are going to go and expire, the pattern of what you're seeing in the past can also form the strategic end to see how your adversary or threat actor or what have you is evolving over time. And what they've tended to rely on in the past may be something they switch up in the future or continue to rely on, and you have to gauge your confidence around that. So even if some of that information looks like it's going to expire, it's still useful on the strategic end.
Yeah, I agree. So like not the actual like atomic indicator, but the TTPs. Yep, for sure. So, yeah, that's the whole kill chain thing, right? I would say the easiest.
Because they always say it's not working because you're not blocking it. If you don't have an advanced threat, you don't have an active threat.
So I have a really good example for you that has nothing to do with CrowdStrike. So Will, you don't have to worry. So when I worked for an energy company, I got on board there and we were still ramping up, and I was leading their information security program. And a peer of mine at another energy company had virus total intelligence, and I didn't. And he had already deployed YARA rules to watch what was getting submitted. He pinged me like on what did he ping me on? I think it wasn't Slack. It might have been Twitter that he pinged me, and he's like, "Hey, I don't know if you saw this yet, but somebody's making a run at you." And I was like, "What?" And he had already seen it because the threat actor was testing his tool that had the strings of our company's name. That rule fired. He told me. I saw it a day and a half later, and so we were prepared. We blocked it already, and I thought that was probably the best example right there of like just no brainer. Like you've got to do something there to stay ahead of the threats.
We're out of time, but
All right, thank you.